Not cry. I did not shake. I stood in the middle of my brother's living room, holding a copy of my grandfather's will, the one they had given me, and I read it 3 times. Then I folded it, put it in my bag, smiled at my sister-in-law, and said the coffee was lovely. She looked almost disappointed. I think she expected tears. Maybe even begging. That was what they were used to from me. They had no idea I had already seen the original. Let me go back, because you need to understand what kind of family I come from before any of this makes sense. My grandfather built everything from scratch, came to this country with almost nothing, settled in a small town outside of Columbus, Ohio, and spent 40 years turning a hardware store into a regional chain. By the time I was born, he had 3 locations, a house paid off in full, and a retirement account that made people pause when they heard the number. He also had 2 grandchildren. My brother Daniel, who was 11 years older than me and had worked in one of the stores for a few summers before deciding it wasn't for him. And me, Victoria, the one who actually stayed. I was 16 when I started working the register on weekends. 18 when Grandpa taught me how to read a balance sheet at the kitchen table, with a cup of black coffee between us and the radio playing in the background. 22 when he made me the store manager of the original location, the one on Maple, because, his words, "You're the only one who actually gives a damn." Daniel never said anything about that at the time. He had his own life by then. A good job in marketing, a house in a suburb of Cincinnati, a wife named Renee who smiled the way people smile when they're calculating something. They came home for Thanksgiving and Christmas and made a lot of noise about how much they loved Grandpa, and then they drove back to Cincinnati. I was there every Tuesday and every Saturday. And the night he fell and I drove him to the ER at 2 in the morning and sat with him until 6. I was there when he started forgetting where he'd put things, and when I gently started going through paperwork with him to make sure everything was organized, and when he sat across from me one afternoon and said, "I already took care of you, don't worry." He passed away in March. He was 81. It wasn't sudden, we had some time to say what needed to be said. But it still felt like someone had reached into my chest and rearranged something. 3 weeks after the funeral, Daniel called and asked me to come to his house for a family meeting. I remember the drive. It was a gray day, the kind Ohio does in early spring where you can't tell if it's about to rain or if it's just always going to look like this. I had my coffee in the cup holder and the radio on, and I told myself it was fine. It was just paperwork, estate stuff, a formality. I should have known from the way Renee opened the door. She had that smile on. The calculating one. The meeting was in their dining room. Daniel sat at the head of the table. His table, his house, the position already staked. And Renee sat to his right and there was a folder in the center of the table. I sat down across from them, wrapped my hands around the coffee mug Renee had handed me, and waited. Daniel pushed the folder toward me. "Grandpa updated his will last year," he said. "We wanted to go through it with you in person, out of respect." I opened the folder. The document said that the estate, the stores, the house, the savings, was to be divided equally between Daniel and me, 50-50, standard. What Grandpa had told me to expect. But there was a clause I had not expected, a clause that said the business assets were to be managed by Daniel as sole executor, with full authority to liquidate or restructure as he saw fit. And that my 50% would be paid out as a cash settlement, appraised value at time of distribution, minus operational debts. I read it twice. "Operational debts?" I said. Daniel nodded slowly, the way people do when they've practiced the nod. "The stores have been carrying some debt. It's been a difficult few years. The settlement would still be significant, Victoria. You'll be fine." I asked how much. Renee answered. Not Daniel. Renee. She said a number, and then she looked at me the way someone looks at you when they expect you to be grateful for it. The number was less than what I made in 3 years managing the store. For half of a business my grandfather had spent 4 decades building. I folded the document, put it in my bag, smiled, said the coffee was lovely, drove home. Sat in my driveway for 11 minutes. Then I called my attorney. Here is what they did not know about me. They thought of me as the quiet one, the one who stayed home, the one who was practical. The one who worked the register and drove Grandpa to doctor's appointments and didn't make waves. In family dynamics, there is always a role assigned to each person, and mine had always been the dependable one who doesn't ask for much. What they failed to notice over the years was that dependable people pay very close attention. I had been organizing Grandpa's paperwork for almost 2 years before he died. Not because I was trying to get anything, because I was trying to help him. He was getting older, things were slipping, and someone had to make sure the bills were paid and the accounts were in order. So I had seen everything. Every document, every version, including the will he had updated 14 months before he passed. That will, the real one, the one he had signed with his estate attorney, the one that had been filed and witnessed and notarized, did not have that clause about Daniel being sole executor. It did not have the language about operational debts being deducted before my settlement. It divided everything equally in plain terms with me listed as co-executor. I had not made a copy of it at the time because I hadn't thought I needed to. But his estate attorney had the original, and estate attorneys keep very good records. I had called her the week after the funeral, before the family meeting, just to ask a routine question about probate timelines. In that conversation, she had mentioned something offhand about the document being exactly as Grandpa had left it. Exactly as he had left it, not as the version in Daniel's folder. So when I sat in my driveway for 11 minutes after that meeting, what I was doing was not grieving, and it was not panicking. I was running through everything I already knew. The timeline, the documents, the signature on that clause that, when I thought about it, looked slightly different from the rest of the page. The fact that Renee's family had a notary in it, a cousin who had done some work for them in the past. I was building a wall, brick by brick, in my mind. Then I called my attorney. Her name is Margaret, and she has been practicing estate law in Ohio for over 20 years, and when I told her what the document said, there was a pause on her line that told me everything. "Bring it to me," she said. "Don't say anything to your brother yet." I didn't. For the next 6 weeks, I went about my life as normally as I could. I went to work. I answered Daniel's emails about next steps for the transition, with polite, non-committal replies. I told him I was still processing Grandpa's death and needed a little time, which was true, and which also bought me the weeks I needed. Margaret was thorough. She pulled the original will from the estate attorney's records and compared it to the version Daniel had given me. The differences were not dramatic. Whoever had done this had been careful. But they were there. The executor clause, the debt deduction language, and one other thing, a small change to a paragraph about personal property, which in the original had specifically named me as the recipient of Grandpa's business records, his ledgers, his files going back to the beginning. In Daniel's version, that paragraph was gone, because if I had those records, I would have been able to see exactly what the operational debts were, and what I would have seen, what Margaret eventually found when we subpoenaed the financial records, was that the debt had been mostly generated in the 18 months since Daniel had gotten limited signing authority over one of the accounts during a period when Grandpa's health was declining, invoices to vendors that didn't quite add up, transfers to a consulting LLC that when you looked into it, was registered to a name very close to Renee's maiden name. Not embezzlement in the dramatic sense, more like a very deliberate draining of resources, timed to coincide with a will that had been quietly altered to make sure no one would look too closely. Margaret laid it all out for me on a Tuesday afternoon in her office, with a yellow legal pad between us and the documents spread out across her conference table. "Victoria," she said, "what your brother did is a felony, document fraud, potentially financial elder abuse under Ohio statute, depending on how the timeline of Grandpa's cognitive decline factors in." I looked at the papers. "What are my options?" I said. She gave me 2. The first, go straight to the DA. Turn everything over. Let the criminal process run. This would be the most complete form of accountability, but it would be public, it would be long, and there was no guarantee of a specific outcome. Civil recovery would happen separately, later. The second, a structured confrontation. Bring Daniel and Renee in with their attorney present, lay the evidence on the table and make clear what we had. Give them the opportunity to sign an agreement, full restoration of the estate as written in the original will, repayment of the diverted funds, and my appointment as sole executor, in exchange for us not filing the criminal complaint that day. The agreement would include language that explicitly preserved my right to file if they ever violated its terms. The second option, Margaret said carefully, is faster. You would recover the estate in weeks rather than years, but some people feel that accountability requires more. I thought about Grandpa, about the 40 years he put into that business, about the way he used to say, "Don't chase what they took. Build something they can't touch." The second option, I said, but I want the criminal documentation ready, all of it. I want them to see the folder. Margaret smiled. It was the kind of smile that made me think she had been waiting for a client like me for a while. We set the meeting for a Thursday morning. Daniel and Renee came with their attorney, a man I'll call Greg, who had done mostly real estate closings and clearly had not anticipated walking into this. I arrived with Margaret. We met at Margaret's office, in the same conference room where she had laid out the documents for me 2 weeks earlier. I wore a grey blazer. I had my coffee. I was completely calm. Greg opened by saying that they were there to facilitate a smooth estate transition and appreciated the family's commitment to working together cooperatively. He used the word cooperatively twice in the first 90 seconds. Margaret let him finish. Then she opened her folder. She didn't make a speech. She didn't accuse anyone of anything, not yet. She simply placed the two wills side by side on the table, the original and the altered copy, and she asked Daniel's attorney if he could direct her to the notarization record for the executor clause, since the stamp appeared to correspond to a date that fell after the estate attorney had filed the original with the court. Greg looked at the documents. The room was very quiet. Renee's jaw moved slightly, like she was trying to find words in a language she no longer spoke. Daniel looked at me for the first time since we'd sat down. His face had gone the color of old concrete. Margaret then placed a second set of documents on the table, the financial records, the vendor invoices, the registration information for the LLC, and she explained, in the same calm, professional tone, what they represented and what Ohio Statute 2913.22 and Section 2111.842 said about them. Greg asked for a moment to confer with his client. "Of course," Margaret said. "We'll step out." We walked to the small waiting area outside the conference room. I got a cup of water from the cooler. Margaret checked her phone. Neither of us said anything because there was nothing that needed to be said. We were back in the room 11 minutes later. Greg said his clients were open to discussing a resolution. Margaret slid the agreement across the table. I will not pretend that what came next was without difficulty. Daniel signed. Renee signed. Their hands were steady, which I found interesting, the kind of steadiness that isn't confidence but is its cousin, the steadiness of someone who has accepted what is happening and is now simply enduring it. The agreement gave me full restoration of my share as written in the original will, co-executor status, repayment of the diverted funds over a structured 18-month schedule, secured against Daniel's personal assets, and a clause, Margaret's addition, which I appreciated deeply, requiring that any future dispute about the estate be mediated by a neutral third party of my choosing. It also, of course, preserved my right to file the criminal complaint at any point if the terms were violated. Greg asked on behalf of his clients whether I would be willing to include a statement saying I had no current intention to pursue criminal charges. Margaret looked at me. "No," I said. It was the first time I had spoken directly in the meeting. Greg nodded. He didn't push it. The agreement was signed and notarized by a notary Margaret had brought herself and filed with the probate court before the end of business that Thursday. I drove home the same way I had driven to Daniel's house that grey morning in early spring. But it didn't feel the same. I don't mean that in a cinematic way, where the sun breaks through the clouds and everything is golden. It was still grey. Ohio in spring is relentlessly grey. But something had settled in me. There is a thing that happens when you grow up being the quiet one, the dependable one, the one who doesn't ask for much. You start to believe, somewhere underneath everything, That quiet and small are the same thing. That not making noise means not mattering. That doing the work without demanding recognition means the work wasn't worth anything. Grandpa never believed that. That was why he made me the manager at 22. That was why the original will was written the way it was. He had been paying attention to who I was for decades, even when no one else was. I think about that a lot. The stores are mine now, half legally, and in practice mostly mine since Daniel has no operational knowledge and has been, as the agreement requires, largely uninvolved. I have started making some changes, new inventory systems, a small renovation on the Maple location, a conversation I've been wanting to have for years with the staff about profit sharing. Daniel and I do not speak beyond what the estate requires. Renee, I have not spoken to at all since that Thursday. I don't know if that will ever change, and I have found, somewhat to my surprise, that I am comfortable not knowing. What I do know is that the business records, Grandpa's ledgers, his files, 40 years of handwritten notes in the margins of spreadsheets, are in my office now, in the original location, where they belong. I went through them on a Saturday, not long after everything was finalized. Most of it was financial, invoices, receipts, correspondence with vendors. But near the back of the last binder, I found something I hadn't expected. It was a letter, not addressed to anyone. Just his handwriting on a plain piece of paper, the way he used to jot things down when he was thinking. It said, "The ones who stay and do the work always know more than anyone thinks. Don't let them convince you otherwise." I don't know if he wrote that for me. I don't know if he wrote it for himself, in some earlier chapter of his own life, when someone had tried to convince him he was less than he was. But I folded it and put it in my wallet, and I have kept it there since. If you've ever been the one who stayed, the one who did the work while everyone else showed up at holidays and called it love, I don't need to explain to you why that letter meant what it did. And if someone in your life is currently trying to tell you that your quiet is the same as your smallness, it isn't. The records don't lie, and neither, eventually, does a court of law. Tell me in the comments. Would you have taken the second option like I did? Or would you have gone straight to the DA? I want to know what you would have done. I've thought a lot about why Daniel did it the way he did. Not the fraud itself, I understand greed, most people do if they're honest, but the specific shape of it, the careful language, the rehearsed nod, the way Renee had the number ready before I even asked. They had planned for the version of me they had always known. The one who stayed quiet, the one who absorbed things and kept moving. They had done the math on that version and decided she would take the number and sign something and feel, underneath it all, like she should probably be grateful. What they never accounted for was what quiet people do with their time. I wasn't quiet because I had nothing to say. I was quiet because I was paying attention. 2 years of paperwork. 2 years of Tuesday afternoons and Saturday mornings and 1-2 a.m. drive to the ER. You don't do that without learning things. You don't sit across a kitchen table from someone for that many hours without understanding who they are and what they built and what they meant for it to become. Grandpa knew that. That's why the original will said what it said. The thing about actions like Daniel's, and I'm not speaking about punishment or justice in any abstract sense, I'm speaking about simple cause and effect, is that they tend to carry their own undoing inside them. He altered a document to take more than he was owed. But to do that, he had to remove the paragraph about the business records. And removing that paragraph is what told Margaret exactly where to look. The cover-up pointed directly at what was being covered. That's not fate. That's just how it works. When you build something on a false foundation, the weight of it eventually finds the crack. What I keep coming back to, though, isn't Daniel or Renee or even the outcome. What I keep coming back to is the letter I found in Grandpa's binder. The one that wasn't addressed to anyone. The ones who stay and do the work always know more than anyone thinks. I don't think wisdom is something you're handed. I think it's something you accumulate in small increments, in ordinary moments, in all the times you chose to stay and pay attention when leaving would have been easier. Grandpa had decades of it. He wrote it down because he had lived it, not because someone told him it was true. And I think that's the thing I want to carry forward. More than the stores or the settlement or any of it, not the victory. The practice. The daily decision to show up, to understand what you're part of, to know your own records well enough that no one can rewrite them for you. Because someone will always try. That's not cynicism, that's just reality. There will always be people who look at your steadiness and see something they can take. The only real protection against that is knowing yourself clearly enough that their version of you never quite fits. Daniel's version of me was a woman who didn't know what she had. He was wrong about that for years before it mattered. Don't let anyone be wrong about you for that long.